Imagine walking home through the woods after visiting a friend. It's a route you've taken countless times before, a short walk from Nathan Road to the trailer park where you live. It's December 13th, 2001, in Nokomis, Alabama. You're 25 years old. You have no idea that this walk will be your last. You have no idea that in just weeks you were supposed to testify against someone who tried to kill you. You have no idea that you'll never make it home. This is the story of a witness who vanished before he could tell his story in court, and the decades-long fight for justice that followed. This is Cold Case Unsealed. If you believe witnesses deserve protection, if you think those who try to silence them should face the ultimate consequences, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. We're diving into cases where the system failed, where justice was delayed, and where families fought for decades to get answers. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Now let's uncover what really happened to the man they called Token. December 13th, 2001. Nokomis, Alabama. A small community where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep, where a man walking home through the woods should be safe. But on this night, a 25-year-old man leaves his friend Donald David Clemens' house on Nathan Road and heads toward his home in a nearby trailer park. The route takes him through a wooded area, a shortcut he's probably used dozens of times before. It's familiar territory. It should be safe. But he never makes it home. 4 days pass before his mother reports him missing on December 17th, 2001. For days of waiting, of hoping he'll walk through the door, of calling around to friends and family trying to find him. For days of growing concern turning into genuine fear. Because mothers know. They know when something is wrong. They know when their child is in danger. And by December 17th, she knows she can't wait any longer. When she files the missing persons report, she tells police the last time she saw her son was on December 13th. She describes how he left Clemens' house, heading through the woods toward home. It was a short walk, maybe 15 or 20 minutes depending on how fast you moved. The kind of walk where you don't think twice about safety because you've done it 100 times before. The kind of walk where you're thinking about what you'll do when you get home, maybe what's for dinner, maybe about the upcoming holidays. But he never arrived. Somewhere between Nathan Road and that trailer park, somewhere in those woods that should have been safe, something happened. Something that meant a 25-year-old man would never be seen or heard from again. His nickname was Token. We don't know the story behind that nickname, whether it was something from childhood or something his friends started calling him later. But that's how people knew him. That's how his friends referred to him. Token. A man with a nickname, with friends, with family, with a mother who would spend years searching for answers about what happened to her son. The initial missing persons investigation would have followed standard procedures. Police would have searched the wooded area between Nathan Road and the trailer park, looking for any sign of him. Did he get injured and unable to make it home? Was there an accident? Did he get disoriented somehow and wander off in the wrong direction? These would be the first theories investigators would explore. They would have interviewed Clemens, the friend whose house he had left from. What time did he leave? What was his mood like? Had they argued about anything? Was he intoxicated or impaired in any way? Did he say anything about being afraid of someone or meeting someone on his way home? Clemens would have been one of the last people to see him alive, which automatically makes him a crucial witness. They would have canvassed the trailer park, talking to neighbors and residents. Had anyone seen him that night? Had anyone heard anything unusual? Did anyone notice any strange vehicles or unfamiliar people in the area around the time he disappeared? They would have checked with other family members and friends. When was the last time they had contact with him? Did he have any plans to leave town? Was he having problems with anyone? Was there anyone who might want to harm him? And this is where the investigation would have taken a very dark turn. Because within weeks of his disappearance, a crucial piece of information would emerge, a piece of information that would transform this from a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister. Let me take you back 6 weeks before his disappearance. October 28th, 2001. He's driving a vehicle on James Road in Nokomis. His 16-year-old niece is with him in the car. Maybe they're running errands, maybe they're just heading home, maybe they're going to visit someone. It's an ordinary day, an ordinary drive on a road they've probably traveled many times before. And then someone opens fire on them. 3 shots. 3 bullets fired into an occupied vehicle, into a car containing a 25-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl. Think about that for a moment. Someone deliberately aimed a weapon at a moving vehicle and pulled the trigger 3 times, knowing full well there were people inside, knowing that those bullets could kill. This wasn't a warning shot. This wasn't someone trying to scare them. This was attempted murder. By some miracle, neither he nor his niece were killed. The bullets hit the vehicle but somehow didn't strike either occupant, or if they did, the injuries weren't fatal. They survived. They were able to tell police what happened. They were able to identify the shooter. His name was Bruce Edward Day. Day was charged with 2 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of shooting into an occupied vehicle. Serious charges. The kind of charges that could put someone away for a very long time. And the case against Day would rely heavily on one thing: the testimony of the 2 people in that vehicle. The testimony of a 25-year-old man and his 16-year-old niece. A trial was scheduled. Day would have to answer for what he did on James Road on October 28, 2001. He would have to face his victims in court. He would have to listen as they described how he opened fire on them, how they feared for their lives, how they watched those bullets tear into their vehicle. But for the trial to proceed, for justice to be served, the witnesses needed to be there. They needed to testify. They needed to tell the court exactly what happened that day. And that's when the timeline becomes incredibly significant. Day was scheduled to go to trial. The witness, the man they called Token, was scheduled to testify against him. And before that trial could happen, before he could tell a jury what Day had done, he vanished while walking through the woods in December 2001. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who survived an assassination attempt, a man who was going to testify against his would-be killer, disappears under mysterious circumstances just weeks before the trial. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't bad timing. This is witness elimination. Think about it from Day's perspective. He's facing attempted murder charges. If convicted, he could spend decades in prison. His freedom, his entire future, depends on the jury not believing the witnesses or the witnesses not showing up to testify. And one of those witnesses, the adult male who could describe in detail what happened that day, who could positively identify Day as the shooter, suddenly goes missing. For Day, this missing witness is a gift. Without his testimony, the prosecution's case becomes much weaker. A 16-year-old girl's testimony alone might not be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, especially if defense attorneys can raise questions about her memory or her ability to accurately identify the shooter in the chaos of the moment. Now let's jump forward to January 2002. Just a few weeks after he disappeared, Bruce Edward Day is pulled over by police on Highway 31 in Nokomis. He's driving a vehicle and he has a passenger with him. That passenger is Donald David Clemens. Yes, the same Clemens whose house the missing man had left from on the night he disappeared. The same Clemens who was one of the last people to see him alive. When police search the vehicle, they find methamphetamine and drug paraphernalia. Day is charged with possession of drugs and drug paraphernalia. These charges are added to the attempted murder charges he's already facing from the October shooting. But here's what's interesting. Clemens is not considered a suspect in the disappearance. Despite being in the vehicle with Day, despite being the friend whose house the victim left from on the night he vanished, police have determined that Clemens isn't involved in whatever happened. Maybe he cooperated fully with the investigation. Maybe he had an alibi for the time of the disappearance. Maybe there was simply no evidence linking him to any crime. But the connection is still there, still troubling. Day and Clemens knew each other well enough to be riding together in a vehicle just weeks after the disappearance. They were associates, possibly friends, possibly involved in the same drug circles given the methamphetamine found in the car. And Clemens' house was the last place the victim was seen alive. The attempted murder trial proceeds without the key witness. The prosecution does the best they can with the evidence they have. The 16-year-old niece testifies. Physical evidence from the shooting is presented. Ballistics, vehicle damage, witness statements, all of it goes before the jury. And Bruce Edward Day is found not guilty of attempted murder. Let me say that again. The man who fired 3 shots into an occupied vehicle, who tried to kill a 25-year-old man and his 16-year-old niece, was found not guilty of attempted murder. The jury didn't believe the evidence was sufficient to convict him of trying to kill 2 people. However, he wasn't completely acquitted. The jury found him guilty of reckless endangerment, a much lesser charge. Instead of decades in prison for attempted murder, Day was sentenced to 1 year in jail for recklessly endangering the lives of 2 people by firing a weapon at their vehicle. 1 year. For shooting at a car 3 times with people inside. Think about how that must have felt for the victim's family. Their son and brother had survived an assassination attempt, had agreed to testify against his attacker, and then disappeared under suspicious circumstances before he could tell his story in court. And the man they believed was responsible for that disappearance, the man who had already tried to kill their loved one once, got a single year in jail for a reduced charge. This is not justice. This is a system failing at every level. But sometimes, even when the system fails initially, persistence pays off. Sometimes families who refuse to give up, who keep pushing for answers, who keep demanding justice, eventually see results. It might take years. It might take decades. But truth has a way of surfacing, even when people try to bury it. October 2009. 8 years after the disappearance. 8 years of a family wondering what happened to their son, their brother, their uncle. 8 years of a mother going to sleep every night not knowing if her son is alive or dead. Not knowing where he is, not knowing if he's coming home. 8 years of birthdays and holidays marked by absence and unanswered questions. And then, finally, movement on the case. Bruce Edward Day is charged with murder. Not attempted murder this time. Not reckless endangerment. Murder. The murder of the man who was supposed to testify against him. The man who disappeared while walking through the woods in December 2001. The man who was never seen or heard from again. What evidence led to this charge? What new information came to light? Did someone come forward with information? Did forensic evidence finally point definitively to Day? Did Day himself say something incriminating? The specifics aren't publicly available, but something happened between 2001 and 2009 that gave prosecutors enough confidence to charge Day with murder, even without a body. Charging someone with murder without finding the victim's remains is incredibly difficult. It's called a no-body case, and they're notoriously hard to prosecute. Juries want to see physical evidence. They want proof that the person is actually dead, not just missing. They want to see a cause of death, a crime scene, something concrete that proves a murder occurred. But prosecutors sometimes move forward with these cases anyway, especially when the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. When a witness against someone disappears right before trial, when that someone has already tried to kill that witness once before, when there's no other reasonable explanation for the disappearance, prosecutors can build a case based on the totality of circumstances. The case moves slowly through the court system. Murder cases always do. There are motions and hearings and legal maneuvering. Day's defense attorneys would have fought the charges, arguing that without a body, without a crime scene, without physical evidence, you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that their client committed murder. But then something unexpected happens. Something that suggests maybe the evidence against Day was stronger than anyone knew. Something that suggests maybe Day knew he couldn't win at trial. March 2012. More than 10 years after the disappearance. Day pleads guilty to the murder. He doesn't go to trial. He doesn't make the prosecution prove their case. He admits it. He pleads guilty to killing the man who was going to testify against him. The man who disappeared in the woods between Nathan Road and a trailer park in Nokomis, Alabama. Why would someone plead guilty to murder if they didn't do it? Why would you accept a prison sentence for a crime you're innocent of? You wouldn't. A guilty plea in a murder case is as close to a confession as you can get without an actual recorded statement saying, "I did it." Day pleads guilty, and the court sentences him to 20 years in prison. 20 years for taking a life, for silencing a witness, for depriving a family of their son and brother for more than a decade before even being held accountable. But here's where the story takes another frustrating turn. Another example of how the justice system can fail victims and their families. Despite the 20-year sentence, Day will only actually serve 3 years in prison. 3 years followed by 7 years on probation. Let me put that in perspective. He took a man's life in 2001. He was charged with that murder in 2009. He pleaded guilty in 2012. And he would be free again after serving just 3 years, sometime around 2015. 3 years for murder. 3 years for witness intimidation of the most permanent kind. 3 years for making sure that a man could never testify, could never see his family again, could never live the life he should have lived. How does this happen? How does a 20-year sentence become a 3-year sentence? It comes down to how sentences are structured, how time served is calculated, how plea deals are negotiated. Maybe Day got credit for time already served. Maybe the plea deal included specific terms about how much of the sentence would be actual incarceration versus probation. Maybe there were factors in the case that led the prosecution to accept a deal that seems, from the outside, impossibly lenient. But try explaining that to a mother who waited 11 years for someone to be held accountable for her son's murder. Try explaining that to a family who lived with uncertainty and grief for more than a decade before getting any answers. 3 years in prison doesn't come close to matching the magnitude of the crime. Now let's talk about what we know happened and what we can reasonably infer based on the facts of this case. We know that on October 28, 2001, Day shot at a vehicle on James Road containing a 25-year-old man and his 16-year-old niece. We know that both survived. We know that Day was charged with attempted murder and was scheduled to go to trial. We know that the adult male victim was going to testify against Day at that trial. We know that on December 13, 2001, less than 2 months after the shooting, the victim disappeared while walking through woods between Nathan Road and his home. We know he was never seen again. We know that Day was later found not guilty of attempted murder but guilty of reckless endangerment, receiving only a 1-year sentence. We know that 8 years later, Day was charged with the victim's murder. We know that Day pleaded guilty to that murder in 2012. Based on these facts, we can reasonably conclude what happened. Day attempted to murder this man and his niece on October 28th. When that attempt failed, when both victims survived and identified him as the shooter, Day knew he was facing serious prison time. He knew the adult male victim's testimony would be damaging, possibly even decisive in securing a conviction. So Day eliminated that witness. He either killed him directly or arranged for someone else to do it. The victim's body was disposed of in a way that has prevented it from being found for more than 20 years now. And without that key witness, Day was able to avoid an attempted murder conviction, receiving instead a minimal sentence for reckless endangerment. It was a calculated move, a brutal, cold-blooded calculation that if you eliminate the witness, you eliminate the strongest evidence against you. And for 8 years, it worked. Day served his 1 year for reckless endangerment and was free, while his victim's family suffered without answers. But here's what Day didn't count on: investigators who wouldn't give up, a family that kept pushing for justice, evidence that eventually led to murder charges even without a body, and his own decision, when faced with that evidence, to plead guilty rather than risk a trial. The question that haunts this case is simple. Where is he? Where are his remains? What did Day do with his body after killing him? The woods between Nathan Road and the trailer park would have been the logical place to dispose of evidence. It was isolated, it was the route the victim was taking. It would have been relatively easy to ambush someone there and hide what happened. But if the body was in those woods, you would think it would have been found by now. Police would have searched that area extensively when he was first reported missing. They would have gone back and searched again when Day was charged with murder. Cadaver dogs, search teams, volunteers, someone would have found something in more than 20 years. So either the body is hidden extremely well in that wooded area, somewhere searchers haven't looked or couldn't access, or it was moved somewhere else entirely. Maybe Day took it somewhere he knew well, somewhere isolated where he didn't think anyone would find it. Maybe he buried it. Maybe he disposed of it in water. Maybe he burned it. Without Day providing that information, without someone who knows what happened coming forward, the location of the remains might never be known. And this is the cruel reality that the victim's family still lives with today. Even though Day pleaded guilty, even though they know what happened to their loved one, they don't have his remains. They can't give him a proper burial. They can't visit a grave. They can't have that final closure of laying him to rest with dignity and respect. This is why no-body murder cases are so particularly cruel for families. They get some answers, they get some justice, but they don't get their loved one back. They don't get to say goodbye properly. There's still that piece missing, literally and figuratively. Think about the niece who was in that car on James Road when Day opened fire. She was 16 years old, probably scared out of her mind as bullets tore into the vehicle around her. She survived, but her uncle, the adult who was with her that day, didn't survive to see justice served for the shooting. He was murdered before he could testify about what happened to both of them. She had to testify at the attempted murder trial without him. A teenage girl, probably terrified, having to face the man who tried to kill her and describe what happened. And her testimony alone wasn't enough to convince the jury of attempted murder. Maybe they questioned her memory. Maybe they questioned her ability to identify the shooter. Maybe they just had reasonable doubt without the corroborating testimony of the adult who was with her. How does she feel knowing that if her uncle had been allowed to live, if he had been allowed to testify, maybe Day would have been convicted of attempted murder? Maybe he would have gone to prison for decades instead of 1 year? Maybe justice would have been served much sooner? These are the ripple effects of murder. It's not just the victim who suffers. It's everyone connected to them. Family members who grieve and search for answers. Friends who wonder what happened. A community that loses trust and safety. A justice system that struggles to hold people accountable when crucial witnesses are silenced. Let's talk about the nature of witness intimidation and witness elimination in criminal cases. When someone is charged with a serious crime, the prosecution's case often relies heavily on witness testimony. Physical evidence is important, but juries want to hear from people who saw what happened, who can describe events in their own words, who can identify the defendant as the perpetrator. Defendants and their associates know this. They know that if witnesses refuse to testify or can't testify, the case against them becomes much weaker. So witness intimidation is unfortunately common in criminal cases, especially cases involving violent crimes or organized criminal activity. Most witness intimidation involves threats. Don't testify or something bad will happen to you or your family. We know where you live. It would be a shame if something happened to your kids. These threats are often enough to scare witnesses into silence. They refuse to cooperate with prosecutors. They suddenly can't remember what they saw. They leave town. They recant their statements. But sometimes intimidation escalates to something far worse. Sometimes witnesses are assaulted to send a message. Sometimes they're killed. And this is what appears to have happened in this case. Day didn't just threaten his would-be witness. He eliminated him permanently. This kind of witness elimination strikes at the very heart of the justice system. If witnesses can be killed to prevent them from testifying, then the system can't function. Criminals can literally get away with murder by making sure no one is left alive to testify against them. It creates a culture of fear where people are afraid to come forward, afraid to cooperate with police, afraid to do the right thing because they know what might happen to them. This is why witness protection programs exist. This is why some jurisdictions take witness intimidation incredibly seriously, prosecuting it aggressively and imposing harsh sentences. Because if we can't protect witnesses, if we can't ensure they can safely testify, then justice becomes impossible. In this case, the victim apparently wasn't offered witness protection or wasn't in a program when he disappeared. Maybe authorities didn't think he was at risk. Maybe they thought Day would be detained pending trial and wouldn't be able to harm him. Maybe resources for witness protection were limited and reserved for higher-profile cases. Whatever the reason, he wasn't protected, and he paid for that failure with his life. If you're still watching at this point, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now and type, "I am here." Show this family that people still care about this case, that their son and brother hasn't been forgotten, that justice matters even when it comes years too late. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive and helps families know they're not alone in their search for answers. Let's examine the timeline of justice in this case more closely, because it reveals a lot about how the system works and how it sometimes fails. October 2001, the shooting occurs. December 2001, the victim disappears. Sometime in 2002 or 2003, the attempted murder trial happens, resulting in a not guilty verdict on the serious charges and a guilty verdict only on reckless endangerment. Then there's a gap. Years pass. Day serves his 1 year for reckless endangerment and is released. The victim's family continues searching for answers, continues pushing police to investigate the disappearance as a murder. They know in their hearts what happened. They know who's responsible. But knowing and proving are different things. October 2009. Finally, 8 years after the disappearance, Day is charged with murder. What happened in those 8 years? Were investigators quietly building a case the whole time? Did new evidence emerge? Did someone come forward with information? Did advances in forensic technology allow them to analyze evidence in new ways? We don't know the specifics, but something shifted. Something gave prosecutors the confidence to bring murder charges in a nobody case, which is always risky. They had to believe they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim was dead and that day killed him, all without physical remains to present to a jury. Then more time passes. From October 2009 to March 2012 is another 2.5 years. The case works its way through the court system. Discovery happens. Motions are filed. Both sides prepare for trial. And then Day pleads guilty, avoiding a trial entirely. Why plead guilty? What was Day looking at if he went to trial and was convicted? In Alabama, murder can carry a sentence of life in prison or even the death penalty in certain circumstances. If Day's attorneys looked at the evidence and told him he was likely to be convicted, then accepting a plea deal for 20 years, even if he'd only served 3, might have seemed like the better option than risking life in prison or death. Or maybe Day was simply tired of fighting. Maybe after more than a decade, maybe with the weight of what he'd done pressing on him, he decided to admit it. Maybe there was a part of him that wanted to be held accountable, wanted to stop lying, wanted to acknowledge what he'd taken from this family. We'll probably never know his true motivations. But the guilty plea stands as an admission of what he did. He murdered a 25-year-old man to prevent him from testifying. He eliminated a witness to protect himself from justice. And in doing so, he caused immeasurable pain to a family that deserved better. Now let's talk about Nokomis, Alabama, the community where all of this happened. Nokomis is a small community in Escambia County in southern Alabama, near the Florida border. It's the kind of place where violent crime is relatively rare, where people generally know their neighbors, where a murder would shake the entire community. When someone disappears from a small community like this, everyone notices. Everyone has theories about what happened. Everyone knows the players involved. There are no anonymous crimes in places like Nokomis. People know who had conflicts with whom, who was involved in drugs, who had made threats, who had motives. So when the victim disappeared, people in Nokomis probably had suspicions right away about who was responsible. They knew about the shooting on James Road. They knew about the upcoming trial. They knew that Day had tried to kill this man once already. When that man disappeared, the connection would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. But suspicion isn't evidence. Local gossip isn't admissible in court. What people think they know and what can be proven are two different things. So the community watched as Day avoided attempted murder charges, as years passed without an arrest for the disappearance, as justice was delayed again and again. How does a community heal from something like this? How do people feel safe when they know a killer walked among them for years before being held accountable? How do you trust that the justice system will protect you when you see how badly it failed in this case? These are questions that communities dealing with unsolved murders or delayed justice have to grapple with. There's a loss of innocence, a loss of trust, a recognition that bad things can happen even in small towns, and that justice isn't always swift or certain. But communities can also be sources of strength and healing. When Day was finally charged with murder, when he finally pleaded guilty, the community could breathe a collective sigh of relief. Not because it brought the victim back, not because it erased the years of pain and uncertainty, but because it meant the truth was finally acknowledged. It meant that what everyone suspected had been proven. It meant that the man who took one of their own had been held accountable, even if that accountability came far too late. Let's consider what life has been like for the victim's mother, the woman who reported him missing and then waited more than a decade for answers. Imagine the torture of not knowing what happened to your child. Every time the phone rings, you wonder if it's news. Every time there's a knock at the door, you hope it's him coming home. Every time you see someone who resembles him from behind, your heart jumps for a second before reality crashes back in. You celebrate his birthday every year, but he's not there. Holidays come and go, and there's an empty chair at the table. You watch other people's children grow up, get married, have kids of their own, and you wonder what your son would be doing if he were still alive. Would he be married? Would you have grandchildren? What would his life have looked like? And underneath all of that is the not knowing. Is he alive somewhere, unable to contact you? Is he dead? If he's dead, where is he? What happened to him? Who hurt him? These questions circle in your mind endlessly, day after day, year after year, with no answers, no closure, no resolution. When Day was finally charged with murder in 2009, this mother must have felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that finally someone was being held accountable. Validation that her suspicions had been correct. Anger that it took 8 years. Grief that the charges confirmed what she probably already knew in her heart. Her son was dead. He wasn't coming home. And then when Day pleaded guilty, there must have been another wave of emotions. The guilty plea meant she didn't have to sit through a trial and relive all the details. It meant she didn't have to worry about Day being acquitted. But it also meant she might never know exactly what happened, where her son's body is, how he died. Day's guilty plea didn't come with full disclosure of the details. It was an admission of guilt, but not necessarily a full accounting of what he did. This is the incomplete justice that families of murder victims often face. They get a conviction, they get someone held accountable, but they don't get all the answers. They don't get their loved one back. They don't get to say goodbye. The hole in their lives remains, even after the legal proceedings conclude. So this mother, wherever she is today, is living with that reality. She knows who killed her son. She saw that person plead guilty and go to prison. But she doesn't know where her son is. She can't visit his grave. She can't have that final closure. And Day served only 3 years before being released, which must feel like the ultimate insult added to decades of injury. Let me talk about the role of drugs in this case, because methamphetamine appears to have been a factor. When Day was pulled over in January 2002, meth and drug paraphernalia were found in the vehicle. This suggests that Day was involved in the drug trade in some capacity, either as a user or dealer or both. Methamphetamine was and remains a significant problem in rural Alabama and across much of the rural South. It's a highly addictive stimulant that can cause paranoia, aggression, and erratic behavior. People high on meth or coming down from meth can be unpredictable and dangerous. The drug trade associated with meth involves violence, territory disputes, debts, and betrayals. Could the shooting on James Road have been drug-related? Could the victim have been involved in the drug trade in some way, and the shooting was related to that rather than being random? Or was Day high on meth when he fired those shots, acting on paranoia or aggression fueled by the drug? We don't have enough information to know for certain, but the presence of meth in Day's vehicle shortly after the disappearance suggests drugs were part of his world. And the drug trade brings with it a culture of violence and silence. People don't talk to police because they're afraid of retaliation. They don't testify because they know what happens to snitches. They don't trust the system because the system has often failed them. This culture of silence makes investigating crimes in drug-connected communities incredibly difficult. Witnesses won't come forward. People who know things won't talk. Evidence gets destroyed or hidden. And killers can operate with a degree of impunity because they know the code of silence will protect them. Breaking through that silence requires building trust with communities, offering protection to witnesses, and making it clear that people who cooperate won't be abandoned or left vulnerable. It's difficult, time-consuming work, but it's essential for solving cases like this one. In this case, it took 8 years to build a case strong enough to charge Day with murder despite the code of silence, despite the lack of a body, despite all the obstacles. Someone must have talked. Someone must have provided information that allowed prosecutors to move forward. Maybe it was someone who was tired of carrying the secret. Maybe it was someone who was offered a deal in exchange for cooperation. Maybe it was forensic evidence that spoke for itself. Whatever broke the case open, it happened. Justice was delayed but not denied. And that should give hope to other families waiting for answers, waiting for someone to be held accountable, waiting for the silence to break. Let's think about what the victim's life might have been like if he had lived. He was 25 years old when he disappeared. That's so young. His whole life was ahead of him. He could have had a career, a family, children, decades of experiences and memories and growth. Instead, his life was cut short because he was willing to testify, willing to stand up in court and tell the truth about what happened to him and his niece on James Road. His willingness to participate in the justice system, to do the right thing, cost him everything. This is the terrible calculus that witnesses have to make in cases involving violent criminals. Do you testify and risk retaliation? Or do you stay silent and let someone get away with a crime? It's not a choice anyone should have to make, but it's a choice that people face every day in courtrooms across the country. He chose to testify. He chose to stand up for himself and his niece. He chose to try to hold Day accountable for shooting at them. And that choice, that brave and correct choice, appears to have led directly to his death. There's something profoundly unjust about that. We ask people to participate in the justice system, to be witnesses, to testify, to help hold criminals accountable. And then when they step up and do the right thing, we sometimes fail to protect them. We fail to keep them safe. We allow them to be harmed or killed by the very people they're trying to bring to justice. This victim deserved better. He deserved protection. He deserved to testify safely and see Day held accountable for the shooting. He deserved to live his life, to watch his niece grow up, to make his own memories and build his own future. Instead, he got a walk through the woods that ended in violence and death. He got a family that spent more than a decade searching for answers. He got a grave that no one can visit because no one knows where his remains are. He got justice that came more than a decade too late and resulted in only 3 years of prison time for his killer. If there's anyone watching this who knows where his remains are, please come forward. His family deserves to be able to lay him to rest properly. They deserve to have a place they can visit, where they can leave flowers, where they can feel close to him. They've suffered enough. Please give them that closure. If there's anyone who has any information about this case that hasn't been shared with police, please contact the authorities. Even if you think what you know is insignificant, even if you're worried about getting in trouble yourself, please come forward. You can do it anonymously. You can call a tip line. You can contact a lawyer who can negotiate protection for you. But please help this family find their son. The impact of witness intimidation and witness murder extends far beyond individual cases. Every time a witness is killed to prevent testimony, it sends a message to every other potential witness in every other case. It says, this is what happens if you talk. This is what happens if you cooperate with police. This is the price you pay for trying to do the right thing. That chilling effect on witness cooperation makes it harder to solve crimes, harder to prosecute criminals, harder to maintain law and order. It creates communities where people are afraid to speak up, afraid to report crimes, afraid to testify even when they've witnessed terrible things. And that fear allows criminals to operate with impunity, knowing that the code of silence will protect them. This is why cases like this one matter so much. This is why we need to talk about them, keep them in the public consciousness, demand accountability when witnesses are harmed. Because if we allow witness intimidation and witness murder to succeed, if we allow killers to silence their accusers and get away with it, then we're essentially giving up on justice. Day didn't get away with it, not completely. He eventually pleaded guilty. He went to prison. But it took 11 years from the murder to the guilty plea. 11 years during which he was free while his victim was dead. 11 years during which the message was sent that you can kill a witness and it might take a decade or more before you face consequences. And even then those consequences might be relatively minimal. 3 years in prison for murder. Think about that. People serve longer sentences for non-violent drug offenses than Day served for killing someone to prevent them from testifying. That's not justice. That's not proportional to the crime. That's not a deterrent that would make someone think twice before eliminating a witness. And what about the message it sends to other would-be witness intimidators? If you're facing serious charges and you think eliminating a witness will help your case, you might look at this case and think it's worth the risk. Even if you eventually get caught and charged with murder, you might only serve a few years. That's a calculation some people might be willing to make, especially if they're already facing life in prison for the original charges. We need to do better. We need stronger witness protection. We need harsher sentences for people who harm witnesses. We need to make it absolutely clear that interfering with witnesses, threatening witnesses, harming witnesses in any way will result in severe and certain punishment. Because if we don't, we're abandoning the fundamental principle that witnesses can safely participate in the justice system. Let's talk about the specific challenges of no-body murder cases, because this is one of those cases and it illustrates why they're so difficult to prosecute. Traditionally, murder prosecutions relied heavily on having a body. The body provided proof that someone was dead rather than missing, provided evidence of cause of death. It could provide forensic evidence linking a suspect to the crime. It gave investigators a crime scene to process. Without a body, prosecutors have to prove that someone is dead based on circumstantial evidence. They have to show that it's more likely than not that the person is deceased rather than simply missing by choice or accident. They have to build a case entirely on indirect evidence, witness testimony, the defendant's statements and behavior, and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance. In this case, the circumstantial evidence was strong. The victim had survived an assassination attempt by Day. He was scheduled to testify against Day. He disappeared right before the trial was supposed to happen. He had maintained regular contact with family, but that contact suddenly ceased. There was no financial activity, no sightings, no evidence he had voluntarily left. And then there was whatever other evidence prosecutors developed during the 8 years between the disappearance and the murder charge, evidence we don't know about, but that must have been significant enough to support a murder charge. All of that together painted a clear picture. Day killed this man to prevent him from testifying. But proving that beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury without a body, without a crime scene, without physical evidence directly linking Day to the killing, would have been challenging. Juries want certainty. They want physical proof. They're sometimes reluctant to convict someone of murder when there's even a tiny possibility that the alleged victim is alive somewhere. That's probably why Day decided to plead guilty rather than go to trial. His attorneys likely looked at the evidence and told him that a jury would probably convict him. They probably explained that if he was convicted at trial, he could face life in prison or even the death penalty. A plea deal for 20 years, even with only 3 years of actual incarceration, would have seemed like a much better option than risking a life sentence. But his decision to plead guilty also means we'll probably never know the full details of what happened. Where did he kill the victim? How did he do it? What did he do with the body? Did he have help? These questions remain unanswered because Day pleaded guilty without providing a full confession or leading authorities to the remains. Some jurisdictions now require that defendants provide information about the location of remains as part of a plea deal in no-body murder cases. They won't accept a guilty plea unless the defendant tells them where the body is. This gives families closure and ensures that defendants can't use information about remains as leverage for better deals later. But that doesn't appear to have been required in this case, which means the family still doesn't know where their son is, even though they know he's dead and they know who killed him. That's a terrible position to be in, having some answers but not all of them, knowing what happened but not where. The 3-year actual prison sentence Day received is shocking and deserves more examination. How does a 20-year sentence for murder become 3 years of actual incarceration? The details of the plea agreement aren't publicly available, but generally this happens through a combination of factors. Defendants often receive credit for time already served while awaiting trial. If Day was held in jail from the time of his arrest in 2009 until his guilty plea in 2012, that's roughly 3 years that would count toward his sentence. So he may have received credit for those 3 years. Additionally, plea agreements sometimes specify that only a portion of the sentence must be served in prison, with the remainder served on probation or supervised release. This is often negotiated as part of the deal to get a defendant to plead guilty and avoid a trial. The prosecution gets a guaranteed conviction without the risk and expense of a trial, and the defendant gets a reduced sentence. Alabama also has various parole and early release provisions that can reduce the amount of time someone actually serves. Good behavior credits, earned time for participating in programs, and parole eligibility can all significantly reduce a sentence. But regardless of the legal mechanisms that resulted in Day serving only 3 years for murder, the outcome is deeply unsatisfying from a justice standpoint. 3 years is nothing compared to the life that was taken. It's nothing compared to the more than 2 decades of suffering this family has endured. It's nothing compared to the severity of the crime. Witness elimination, which strikes at the very heart of the justice system. Families of murder victims often feel betrayed by plea deals that result in reduced sentences. They weren't consulted about the deal, or if they were told this was the best outcome they could hope for. They watch the person who killed their loved one admit guilt and then get what seems like a slap on the wrist. They see that person eventually released from prison, free to live their life while their loved one is still dead. This is the painful reality of the criminal justice system. It's not designed primarily to provide satisfaction or closure to victims' families. It's designed to determine guilt and impose legally appropriate sentences. What's legally appropriate and what feels just to a grieving family are often very different things. But we can and should question whether 3 years in prison for murdering a witness is legally appropriate. We can and should push for changes to how these cases are prosecuted and sentenced. We can and should advocate for mandatory minimums for witness intimidation that results in death. Because the current system clearly isn't working if someone can kill a witness and be free again after just 3 years. Now let's consider what Day's life has been like since his release from prison. He served his 3 years, presumably got out around 2015, and has been on probation since then. What's it like to live as a convicted murderer? How do you reintegrate into society after admitting you killed someone to prevent them from testifying against you? Being a convicted felon, especially a convicted murderer, comes with significant restrictions. It's difficult to find employment because most employers won't hire someone with a murder conviction. It's difficult to find housing because many landlords won't rent to felons. Depending on the terms of his probation, he may have had restrictions on where he could live, who he could associate with, whether he could leave the state. He also has to live with the knowledge of what he did. He has to live in the same general area where the crime occurred, where people know who he is and what he did. He has to face the possibility of running into the victim's family members. He has to carry the weight of having taken a life and destroyed a family. Or maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he's a sociopath who feels no remorse. Maybe he's told himself a story where he was somehow justified or where it wasn't really his fault. Maybe he's managed to compartmentalize it and just lives his life without thinking about what he did. We can't know what's in his head or his heart, but we can know that he's free, living somewhere, while his victim is still missing, still unfound, still unburied. That's the reality of this case. The killer got 3 years in prison and is now living his life. The victim's family still doesn't know where their son is. If Day has any humanity left in him, if there's any part of him that feels remorse for what he did, he should tell authorities where the remains are. He should give this family the closure they deserve. He's already pleaded guilty. He's already served his sentence. He has nothing to lose by telling the truth about what he did with the body, but everything to gain in terms of making some small attempt at atonement for the irreparable harm he caused. But he hasn't done that. As far as we know, he's never told anyone where the victim's body is. He's never led authorities to the remains. He's chosen to keep that information to himself, to maintain control over the one thing the family desperately wants to know. That choice speaks volumes about his character and his lack of remorse. Let me share some thoughts about how this case could have been prevented. The shooting on James Road happened on October 28, 2001. Day was charged with attempted murder. A trial was scheduled. The victim was going to testify. These are all facts that were known to law enforcement and prosecutors. At that point, someone should have recognized that this witness was at risk. Day had already tried to kill him once. Day was facing serious charges that would likely result in decades in prison if the witness testified. Day had every motivation to prevent that testimony from happening. The risk factors were all there. The victim should have been offered witness protection or at minimum should have been warned about the danger he was in. He should have been given options: relocation assistance, police protection, surveillance of his residence. Something should have been done to keep him safe until the trial. But apparently none of that happened. He continued living in the same trailer park, taking the same route through the woods, living his normal life without special protection. And Day, who was presumably free on bail awaiting trial, had access to him, had the opportunity to harm him, had the means and motive to eliminate him as a witness. This is a systemic failure. The criminal justice system knows that witnesses in violent crime cases are at risk. We have programs and protocols designed to protect them. But those programs and protocols are only effective if they're actually implemented. If this victim was never offered protection, never warned about the risk, never given options to stay safe, then the system failed him catastrophically. Of course, even with warnings and offers of protection, some witnesses decline. They don't want to uproot their lives. They don't want to live in fear. They don't believe they're really in danger. It's possible the victim was offered protection and turned it down, but we don't know that. And unless we know for certain that protection was offered and refused, we have to assume it wasn't offered at all. This points to a broader problem in how we handle witness protection in this country. It's often reserved for high-profile cases, organized crime cases, federal prosecutions. Local prosecutors in small jurisdictions often don't have the resources or infrastructure to provide witness protection, even when it's clearly needed. They rely on witnesses to protect themselves or hope nothing bad happens. That's not good enough. If we're going to ask people to testify, if we're going to ask them to stand up in court and face someone who's already shown they're capable of violence, then we need to protect them. We need to give them the resources and support they need to testify safely. Anything less is a betrayal of the social contract that says if you cooperate with the justice system will protect you. This victim cooperated. He agreed to testify, and the system failed to protect him. That failure cost him his life and left his family devastated for more than 2 decades. We have to do better. We have to learn from cases like this and implement changes that will prevent the next witness from suffering the same fate. Let's talk about the current status of this case. Day pleaded guilty in 2012 and served 3 years in prison. He's been out since approximately 2015, presumably still on probation until his full 20-year sentence is completed, which would be 2032 based on when he pleaded guilty. But the case isn't truly closed because the victim's remains have never been found. In many jurisdictions, cases where the body hasn't been recovered remain technically open even after someone has been convicted of the murder. There's always the possibility that new information will emerge about the location of the remains. Investigators may periodically revisit the case, looking at new areas based on tips or new information. They may use new technology like ground-penetrating radar to search areas that were previously searched. They may re-interview witnesses or associates of Day to see if anyone will provide information about what he did with the body. But as time goes on, finding the remains becomes less and less likely. 23 years have passed since the murder. The landscape has changed. Buildings have been constructed. Roads have been built or expanded. Bodies of water have shifted. Whatever markers Day might have used to remember where he put the body are likely gone. And Day himself, even if he wanted to lead authorities to the remains, might not be able to remember exactly where they are after more than 2 decades. Memory fades. Landmarks change. What seemed like a distinctive location in 2001 might be unrecognizable now. But hope isn't completely lost. People have found remains decades after murders occurred. Construction projects uncover buried bodies. Hikers stumble across bones in remote areas. Drought conditions expose remains in bodies of water. It's possible that someday, somehow, the victim's remains will be discovered and his family will finally be able to lay him to rest. In the meantime, his family lives with the incomplete closure of knowing what happened but not knowing where he is. They know Day killed him. They know it was to prevent him from testifying. They know justice was eventually served, even if inadequately. But they don't know where their son, their brother, their uncle is, and that not knowing is its own special torture. The broader implications of this case extend to how we think about justice, accountability, and the value of human life. When someone can murder a witness, hide the body, and ultimately serve only 3 years in prison, what does that say about how seriously we take these crimes? What does it say about how we value the lives of victims? It says that in the calculation of the criminal justice system, avoiding the expense and uncertainty of a trial is worth accepting a plea deal that results in minimal actual incarceration. It says that getting a conviction, any conviction, is more important than ensuring the punishment fits the crime. It says that administrative convenience and resource constraints take precedence over true justice for victims and their families. I'm not saying plea deals are always wrong. They serve important purposes in our justice system. They allow prosecutors to secure convictions in cases where a trial might result in acquittal. They save resources that can be used on other cases. They provide certainty and closure for victims' families who don't have to endure a lengthy trial. But not all plea deals are created equal. Some are necessary compromises that balance competing interests. Others, like the one in this case, seem to undervalue the life that was taken and the harm that was caused. 3 years for murdering a witness is not a reasonable compromise. It's an injustice compounded on top of the original injustice of the murder itself. We need to have serious conversations about how plea deals are negotiated in murder cases, especially in cases involving witness intimidation. There should be minimum sentences that can't be negotiated away. There should be requirements that defendants provide information about the location of remains as a condition of any plea deal. There should be greater involvement of victims' families in the plea negotiation process. These changes won't bring back the victim in this case or in any other case, but they might prevent future victims. They might make would-be killers think twice before eliminating a witness. They might ensure that when someone is killed, their killer faces consequences proportional to the crime they committed. As we near the end of the story, I want to return to where we started. A 25-year-old man walking home through the woods in Nokomis, Alabama on December 13, 2001. He had survived an assassination attempt 6 weeks earlier. He was planning to testify against the man who tried to kill him. He had family who loved him, a life ahead of him, a future that should have been long and full. But someone decided that future was expendable. Someone decided that preventing his testimony was worth taking his life. Someone made a calculated, cold-blooded decision to eliminate a witness, and then spent more than a decade evading justice for that decision. That someone eventually pleaded guilty, eventually admitted what he did, eventually went to prison. But he served only 3 years, and he never told anyone where he put the body. He never gave the family the closure they deserved. He never showed any real remorse or attempt to make amends for the harm he caused. So the victim, the man they called Token, remains missing. His body has never been found. His family has never been able to give him a proper burial. After more than 2 decades, they're still waiting for that final piece of closure, still hoping that somehow, someday, they'll be able to bring him home. This is the reality of unresolved cases, even when there's been a conviction. This is the pain that families live with when their loved ones remain missing. This is why we keep telling these stories, keep pushing for answers, keep demanding that cases like this remain in the public consciousness. If you've made it this far, thank you for caring about this case. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for being someone who believes that every victim deserves justice, every family deserves closure, and every witness deserves protection. Now I'm asking you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button right now. Show this family that people care, that their son hasn't been forgotten, that justice matters even when it comes too late. Second, subscribe to Cold Case Unsealed and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. We're committed to telling the stories that need to be told, giving voice to victims who can't speak for themselves, and keeping pressure on these unsolved and under-resolved cases. And third, drop a comment. Share your thoughts about this case. Share your theories about where the remains might be. Share your outrage about the 3-year sentence. Share your support for this family. Your engagement matters more than you know. And if you have any information about this case, if you know where the victim's remains are, if you know anything that could help this family finally bring their son home, please contact the Escambia County Sheriff's Office or the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. You can do it anonymously. You can work through an attorney if you're concerned about legal implications. But please, if you know something, say something. This family has suffered for more than 20 years. They deserve closure. They deserve to be able to lay their son to rest with dignity and love. This is Cold Case Unsealed. We don't let the forgotten stay forgotten. We don't let cases fade into obscurity just because time has passed. We keep asking questions. We keep demanding answers. We keep fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes, no matter how cold the trail has become. Because every missing person matters. Every murdered witness deserves justice. Every family deserves to know what happened to their loved one. And every killer, no matter how long they've evaded accountability, should eventually face the consequences of what they've done. The man they called Token deserved better than he got. He deserved to testify safely. He deserved to live his life. He deserved to be found and properly buried. He deserved justice that was swift and proportional to the crime committed against him. He didn't get those things, but we can honor his memory by demanding better for the next witness, the next victim, the next family devastated by violence and loss. We can push for reforms that protect witnesses, that ensure adequate punishment for those who harm them, that give families the closure they desperately need. That's how we turn tragedy into change. That's how we make sure these deaths, these injustices, these failures of our system aren't completely in vain. We learn from them. We do better. We refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Token's story isn't over. His remains are still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. His family is still searching for that final piece of closure. And we're still here, telling his story, keeping his case alive, refusing to let him be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can bring justice to those who deserve it. Together, we can ensure that the forgotten are remembered and the silenced are heard. This is Cold Case Unsealed. See you in the next case. And remember, if you know something, say something. Someone out there has the answers this family needs. Be brave enough to come forward. Be compassionate enough to give them closure. Be the person who finally brings Token home.